concept we're working with is evolutionary teleonomy. And a lot of people don't know what teleonomy is, and that's fine. We'll get into that. And I'm proposing evolutionary teleonomy as a unifying concept for the extended evolutionary synthesis. And a lot of people don't know what the extended evolutionary synthesis is, and that's fine as well. We'll get into that too. So kind of as a preview of my talk, since most people are unaware of both these terms, we're going to start out talking about what is the extended evolutionary synthesis. We'll look at the history of evolution and see where that came from. And then the kind of one of the things that the extended synthesis has gotten into problems is that they don't really have a unifying concept. Then we'll talk about what teleonomy is and the development of that concept, especially in the early middle of the 20th century. And then we'll talk about how they relate and how teleonomy can be used as a unifying concept for the extended evolutionary synthesis. And then we'll analyze some of the advances that the extended synthesis has made and why teleonomy is such a great underpinning factor of that. So we're going to do a quick overview of the development of evolutionary theory from the time of Darwin. All right. So before Darwin, we had there was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and basically he believed that evolution, to the extent that it occurs, is based on the internal drives of organisms to find goals, the final goals. So it was a very teleological view of evolution. Robert Chambers didn't really specify a mechanism, but they believed evolution was a series of progressive changes over time. And Darwin believed in common ancestry, but without the mechanism. So Darwin's big idea was to come up with a mechanism to unify the concept of evolution. Okay, and so he believed that changes to organisms occur for non-teleological reasons. Okay, there's no purpose behind the changes. So natural selection directionalizes the changes that get complex structures out of non-teleological changes. So because of natural selection, so change kind of moves around in change kind of moves around in kind of an amorphous, haphazard way, but natural selection channels that to specific ends. But Darwin had this weird idea for inheritance, which he called pangenesis, and basically it was a feedback mechanism, because what Darwin thought was that changes that happened to an organism in its life were then carried on by its ancestors. So if you injure your arm, your children would have weaker arms, or something to that effect. So shortly after Darwin came the first thing that was referred to as Neo-Darwinism, which is the biometric view. And this is basically the replacement of Darwin's pangenesis theory. It's August Weismann is probably the main person behind that, and basically held that heredity is unidirectional. There's no feedback from the living organism. So the germ plasm itself is what causes heredity. It's not. There's no changes that happen to you. It's just there's no changes that happen to you. It's just that you have it's whatever happens with the germ plasm. And so the Alfred Russel Wallace also modified Darwin's views by placing more of an emphasis on environment than on competition for natural selection. So the first Neo-Darwinism is called the Biometric View because it focused on continuous characters of animals. All right, and so basically organisms, they kind of blended into each other because of germplasm mixing. So then we have the modern synthesis, which is the second theory called Neo-Darwinism. That's what, when we refer to Neo-Darwinism today, usually referring to the modern synthesis. Okay, so basically you have kind of this conflict between Gregor Mendel, whose idea of genes was discrete heritable units, and then the biometricians who viewed inheritance as being on a continuum. And so basically R.A. Fisher showed that the action of many genes together can give the appearance of continuous variation. Okay, so that kind of brought the two camps together. So then they developed a mathematical theory of population genetics, and then experimental genetics, and then you have Ernst Mayr. And Ernst Mayr made several contributions to the modern synthesis, but I think that his biggest contribution was just the fact that he lived a very long time. He was a biologist. He was great at what he did. He was well respected, and his career basically spanned from the start of the modern synthesis to just a few years ago. I mean, he's been active in biology for a very, very long time, and kind of has brought the modern synthesis through to the modern era. And so his work has been foundational for biologists for not only his generation, and not only the next generation, but the generation after that. I mean, his influence keeps on going. In fact, his books are still well read. His papers are still well cited. So Ernst Mayr, one of the important things is selection acts on organisms, not individual genes. But I mean, more than just his individual contributions, the fact that his lifespan went over all these generations, I think really paved the way for the modern synthesis to take hold. So the modern synthesis has these basic features. Genes are the fundamental of inheritance. Evolution occurs through mutations of the genes. The direction and pace of genetic mutation is haphazard, and it's independent of the needs of the organism. This is usually abbreviated as random mutation. But it's not random in the sense of a uniform distribution. It's just random in the sense that the direction is not considered to be based on the organism's needs or any sort of teleology within the organism. So the changes that do occur are filtered and directionalized through natural selection, and repetition of this process over large periods of time allow for the generation of every organismal group and trait. Okay, so that's the modern synthesis in a nutshell. There's talk recently of the need for a new evolutionary synthesis, and there's a couple of really important reasons for this. First of all, the modern synthesis, we don't realize, but it actually predates the discovery of DNA, which is kind of a fascinating fact in and of itself. I think it's kind of overly focused on Mendelian-based heritability. We'll see that there's other types of heritability that have been discovered. The modern synthesis really leaves out the organism. Like if you think about random mutations, natural selection, what is the organism doing? I mean, obviously the organism has to participate to be alive, but the organism is really a passive object in the modern synthesis. And it's a very one-dimensional mode of causality. You have these mutations that essentially have no purposeful cause, and then natural selection, and then the result. And these views of mutation, selection, and adaptation is very outdated. So these are the things that have prompted people to look for a new synthesis. So Massimo Pigliucci and Gerd Mueller have developed, or at least started to develop, what they call the extended evolutionary synthesis. And we'll abbreviate that EES. And there's a lot of different things that are involved in this. The book is, I think it's about 20 chapters, and each one presents a different idea. But, you know, a lot of stuff on path-dependent evolution, on facilitated variation, different modes of inheritance. You know, we discovered epigenetics, niche inheritance, cultural inheritance. You know, there's a lot of different levels of inheritance than just genes, and they actually do have biological significance. And so if you try to force all these different things under the paradigm of mutation selection for evolution, you lose out on a lot. Then there's the role of developmental biology in evolution. You know, the random mutation natural selection, I mean, it doesn't have much to say about developmental biology. And then there's other changes in our understanding of both the organism and evolution that need to be taken into account. And this is what the extended synthesis at least attempts to do. Now, there's been a conflict on whether this is a refinement or a revolution. So the question is, are we merely refining our notion of how random mutation and natural selection acts, or are we overturning this fact? Are we just learning more details about the modern synthesis, or is this really something different? Okay, and so that's where we're going to leave this question off for the moment. So let's just kind of cap that and go into the next part, which is on teleology and teleonomy. All right, so teleology, I hope you all realize, is things that happen for a purpose, and theologically that's been tied to higher purposes, such as God's purposes. So now in biology, we know that organisms exhibit purposeful behaviors. That happens all the time. This is a trait of biology. And so this has been termed teleology. But the problem is that this gets if you call that teleology, what philosophers and theologians are doing is also called teleology. And so it's made some people uncomfortable because they don't want teleology in nature. If you think there's a difference between an organism operating for its own end and an organism operating in the context of God's plan. They might both be the same thing, but that's not something that you can just say out of the box. So to have the same term used for both of them causes a lot of confusion. Okay, and so biologists haven't really, some unscrupulous theologians sometimes take that as instantaneously, without doing the extra work required, point to these things being indicative of higher purposes. So this confusion on teleology and its relationship to biology prompted the need to do something about it. So there's been several solutions proposed, and the first one is just to drop teleology altogether. Okay, and according to Colin Pittendry, I think that's how you say his name, is that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in order to avoid this overlap of teleology, that some biologists were actually erasing all purposeful language from any biological description. So when we would normally say the turtle goes to shore in order to lay its eggs, these biologists would just say the turtle goes to shore and lays its eggs. So there's just a sequence of events. There's no implied purpose there. And so they tried to remove organisms from all teleological action. But the problem with this is that organisms really do act for a purpose. I mean, it's hard to measure, it's hard to describe, it's one of those fuzzy concepts, but it's nonetheless, it's a true concept, and we can't really do biology without it. So if you try to just scrub any sort of purpose from biology, you wind up actually missing biology altogether. So what Pittendry suggested and Meyer approved of is introduce a new term, which he called teleonomy. Okay? So you continue to use teleology to refer to larger purposes, and teleonomy refers to anything that acts according to a purpose because of a program. So for example, your computers are teleonomic, but they're not necessarily teleological. They don't have purposeful drives towards anything, but they have programs, and the programs accomplish things that achieve purposes. Okay, so what Meyer said is that biology concentrates on programmed purposes of organisms, and so therefore, if you use this term teleonomy, it separates the relationship between programmed purposes and higher purposes. Okay, so we can kind of separate those two. Now, this introduction of this term is helpful as far as it goes, but the modern synthesis actually went a step further because they viewed mutation as random. They used teleonomy to disconnect biology from teleology. So rather than using teleonomy as a way to separate out the question of higher purposes and organisms. They actually decide to get into the discussion themselves by saying because Darwin proved, basically because mutations are not oriented toward any teleological purpose. Therefore, these programs, this teleonomy within organisms, they are not indicative of a higher purpose. So they kind of did a 1-2 trick. They tried to introduce a term that allowed separation, but then they went in and decided they tried to decide the issue themselves. Which, I mean, you can. I don't begrudge them their entrance into the conversation, but I think they went a little too fast. So basically, this is what Marr said. He said only 3 processes are known to change the genetic pool: mutation, fluctuation in genetic frequencies, and differential reproduction. The first 2 of these processes are not oriented toward adaptation. They are, in that sense, essentially random and are usually inadaptive, though they may rarely and coincidentally be adaptive. So basically saying that mutations are not oriented toward any purpose. And he goes on to say, if an organism is well adapted, if it shows superior fitness, then it is not due to any purpose of its ancestors or of an outside agency. So it's not because there's purpose in, it's not because the organism was trying to get there. It wasn't because of the organism's genes weren't trying to make an adaptation. It wasn't because God made an adaptation, but just because of accident. Okay, and this is not just Marr. This is basically every voice from the modern synthesis says the same thing. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all these, but these are other people in the modern synthesis. In addition to that, not only was this the case in the 50s, this carries over to modern evolutionary theory. Okay, so we have the same thing is Templeton and population genetics and microevolutionary theory, Hamilton's population genetics, Hartle's genetics analysis of genes and genomes, Berkeley's Understanding Evolution website under the University of California Museum of Paleontology, the National Academy of Science in their teaching about evolution and the nature of science. All of these still point to the modern synthesis view that evolution is essentially unguided. Okay, and so just to kind of summarize this up in pictures, kind of the teleological view is that the ultimate, whether that's God or nature or however the ultimate exists, kind of sets direction for the universe that basically allows evolution, and this evolutionary process sets the direction for the benefit of organisms, and then the organisms act in ways to benefit themselves. So that's kind of the teleological view. And under the teleonomic view of the modern synthesis, since evolutionary changes are haphazard, that means they can't come from any ultimate source. And so since the changes are haphazard, it can't be said to be guiding anything. So evolution is neither being guided nor guiding. And so it is the only part of this that acts for a purpose is the organism itself, which is itself not influencing evolution, but just working on its own thing. So that is teleonomy in a nutshell. So in short, the modern synthesis says organisms have teleonomy and evolution does not. Okay. So now what I want to talk about is evolutionary teleonomy. Okay. And so the idea behind evolutionary teleonomy is just as we can. So even though we couldn't measure purpose in biology, we can't really measure that a sea turtle comes to shore to lay its eggs. We just know that that's what it's doing, and that's what it is. So just the same way we can detect purpose in all the things that organisms do, we can, whether or not we can measure them, which we'll talk in the next talk about whether or not we can measure them. But I just want to point out that it doesn't require measurement in order to understand it. So evolution, if it's guided by a program, we can also say that it exhibits teleonomy in exactly the same way that organisms do. So if we discovered teleonomy, it would require rethinking the basics of how the modern synthesis views evolution. Okay, so if evolution is itself run by a program, then that it instantaneously overwrites most of the modern synthesis. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is that we already have teleonomy in some really interesting places. Just to start with, selection. Most of people, natural selection means that the environment kills you off if you're not adapted to it. Okay, so that's a very passive thing. The environment is what kills you off. The organism doesn't decide to die in order to allow evolution to go forward. But what we actually find in biology is that selection happens inside the organism more than it happens outside of it. You have programmed cell death. Every single level of biology has programmed death. From organelles to cells to organs to entire beings have programmed death sequences. Okay, and most of those exist to cull bad configurations. So if you're culling a bad configuration, that means you have some sort of goal configuration that you're doing instead, or a goal set of configurations. I think one of the things that has been problematic is that we haven't been careful in our language to distinguish between fixed goals and goal sets. So if you don't have just because you don't have a singular fixed destination doesn't mean you don't have a destination. So then with sexual selection, so people forget that sexual selection is based on an organism's programming. So organisms are programmed to seek out mates, and the reason why sexual selection is said to work is that you look for stronger mates. Well, if you're looking for stronger mates, then you have a program that's telling you how to produce better offspring. So you have an evolutionary program that's guiding selection. In niche construction, organisms create their own niches in order to give themselves a better selective environment. So they're creating their own environment for natural selection. In humans, I don't approve of eugenics, but in fact humans have, in fact, engaged in eugenics to direct their evolution. So then if human behavior is caused by our biology, and our behavior is then directing evolution, then that means that our biology is directing evolution. So this is teleonomy in evolution. And then what's more surprising to most people is that the generation of mutations has also been shown to be teleonomical. So first of all, most people don't realize that to get certain classes of mutations requires specific cellular machines. It's usually assumed that mutations just happen. They're accidents. They're missteps. Actually, what happens in a lot of the time is that organisms under stress, you have more than one DNA replicator. They're called DNA polymerases. Okay, and there's more than one of them, and your body will actually switch from a very high fidelity polymerase to a low fidelity polymerase if it thinks that your body needs mutations. So it is intentionally creating mutations, and different polymerases have different types of mutations that they create. And then so if you have another feature is that if in your antibody generation, okay, if you have a new antigen come in, your body does what's called somatic hypermutation. That's where it will literally focus mutations on the correct half of the correct gene until it gets a correct configuration. Okay, and we're going to actually quantify that a little bit more in the next talk. Then E. coli has mechanisms for inserting specific insertion sequences into DNA based on specific environmental needs. So the E. coli is actually specifically directing DNA insertions based on its environmental needs. A lot of bacteria have contingency loci, which are locations that allow organisms to quickly switch logical changes of biochemistry. So they have a little switch. If you switch it one way, it gives you one biochemistry. If you switch it another one, it gives another one. And this will affect things like your bacterial protein code. Some organisms use pseudogenes as templating mechanisms for creating and modifying genes. And then just in general, we found that mutational hotspots are heavily correlated with adaptive areas instead of housekeeping areas of the genome. Your body knows which areas of the genome are focused on exterior adaptation and focuses mutations in the areas that are likely to produce benefit. Okay? There's also teleonomy in non-traditional inheritance, which this is perhaps a little bit more obvious because behavior obviously is very teleonomic, and culture is very teleonomic. But there's a new science called eco-devo, and that is not evo-devo, which is also interesting, but eco-devo. And eco-devo is that organisms are sometimes able to detect their environment in utero and have alternative developmental pathways based on other organisms in the environment, other environmental factors, drought conditions. And so you'll literally have organisms that change based on their ecological environment during development. And additionally, if that happens for many generations in a row, that change can sometimes become permanent. Epigenetics, a lot of non-traditional inheritance ways. So now if you look at the extended evolutionary synthesis, one of the big issues with the extended synthesis is that it hasn't had any unifying concepts. There's nothing that they've been able to point to and say, this is the extended synthesis. They just say, well, it's a lot of new stuff in biology. And then everyone's like, well, we have the modern synthesis, which is really easy to say, random mutation and natural selection. And all you have to say is lots of new stuff in biology. So what is it about the extended synthesis that's new? And so what I would say is that if most of the advances of the extended evolutionary synthesis are based on the concept of evolutionary teleonomy, this concept that evolution itself is driven by biological programs. And since evolutionary teleonomy is explicitly counter to the expectations of the modern synthesis, then that, and teleonomy is at the heart of the development of the EES, then if they were to adopt evolutionary teleonomy as a unifying concept, then we can use the extended synthesis to set up the next iteration of biological inquiry. Because what happens is that a lot of people don't think these philosophies of science and these general patterns do much. They say, well, it's not very important. But actually it is, because they set up kind of the initial expectations that biologists have going into their work. And this kind of directionalizes thought. And if your thought is still being directionalized by the old idea of random mutation and natural selection, even the idea of neutral theory, you're going to be looking in the wrong places for results. But instead, if you train them on the concept of evolutionary teleonomy, that's an easy to understand way. You just say, oh, it's evolution acting according to plan. So this automatically leads you to some very obvious results. Say, oh, well, I should be looking for what the program is. I should be doing that sort of thing. I should be looking for what's being programmed. What is the purposes of these evolutionary systems? What are they doing? And some really natural questions that flow from it. So all of these concepts from the extended synthesis can use evolutionary teleonomy as a foundational principle. And I'm basically running out of time here, but I'm basically at the end as well. So in the last few, a lot of this stuff has only come out in the last few decades, but over and over again, we see teleonomy and evolution being at the heart of what's going on. So just to kind of recap, in the modern synthesis, the idea is that you have random mutation, genetic alterations are non-teleonomic, you have natural selection, which guides it, but also is non-teleonomic. The selection in modern synthesis is not a directed selection, it's the environment just killing you. And then the organism's teleonomic behavior arises entirely from non-teleonomic forces. And the organism does not participate at all in its own evolution. But in the extended evolutionary synthesis under teleonomy, the evolutionary beneficial mutations are oftentimes teleonomic. Prior information affects evolutionary direction and success. Selection itself is teleonomic. And an organism's teleonomic behavior arises from existing teleonomic forces from evolution. And then organisms can participate at any level of purpose. So this is kind of what I view as a teleonomic view under the extended evolutionary synthesis. So we can leave whether or not teleonomy is connected to the ultimate as an open question. We don't have to answer that to detect teleonomy in evolution. We can just say, oh look, here's what's happening in evolution. We have these processes going according to these purposes for the organism, and we don't have to connect it to teleology, though it would be pretty easy for someone to make such an argument, but you don't have to do that as a biologist. In evolution, organisms are being programmed by evolution for certain types and classes of outcomes, and then organisms themselves behave according to purposes on multiple levels. They behave according to purposes for themselves, they behave according to purposes for their evolution, and as you know, there is a biological study of religion. Organisms participate in looking at benefiting ultimate things. And so the organism actually participates in every level of evolution rather than being left out. So evolutionary teleology provides a coherent, succinct understanding of modern evolutionary processes. It's a nice review of the fruits of the research of the last few decades. It gives an implied research direction and starting point that guides research into fruitful directions. And it expands evolution to be more than just gene-based inheritance. And it's philosophically neutral because we're only looking at evident purposes, locally evident purposes in biological evolution. And so it can be a unifying principle for the extended synthesis that is directly opposed to the modern synthesis and justifies the extended syntheses as a unique form. So I know that was a lot to throw out at you all, but anyway, I didn't know if anyone had any questions on it or any comments.
Well, I thought it was a very good talk, Dennis Polis. Earlier in my article about mind and randomness, I questioned the idea that natural selection is purposeless in that it is a consequence of the laws of nature, and it has an analogy in the artificial intelligence profession with the notion of generate and test. In artificial intelligence, one of the methods of problem solving is to generate a bunch of random solutions or random proposals and then test them. So one could view the standard evolutionary story in that way, in that we have random mutations, and then, but the test is quite deterministic and dictated by the natural laws, and so it doesn't mean, so the fact that there is randomness involved does not rule out the fact that this is an intelligent process.
Yeah, I would agree with that generally, but I also just wanted to point out that I mean both the generational process. I mean, I was trying to point out some examples in my limited time, but this is not just me speculating that there might be non-random forces. There really are these mechanisms happening that you have 3 billion base pairs in your genome, and when a new antigen comes along, your body mutates only 600 of them. There's a set of 600 that it looks for the mutation in. In fact, there's a non-coding sequence that targets that, so that if you move the non-coding sequence, it will actually change where these mutations are targeted. And so anyway, so I agree that just because there's randomness involved does not necessarily remove it from teleonomy. And in fact, there still is some form of randomness involved. The question is to what degree, because you wind up, as Bob Marks likes to point out, you wind up in a huge dimensional complexity issue if you only have randomness. And this is actually one thing that most people miss in AI and genetic algorithms and that sort of thing. The biggest source of information are actually the list of parameters that it evolves by. People are like, oh, well, if I set these parameters, it can evolve on its own. Well, the list of parameters itself is actually one of the biggest sources of information in those sorts of things.
Jonathan, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
It's related back to what I was talking about earlier about the time issue. If we've got, and yeah, that seems to be that there are some pretty amazing things going on that do have seemingly teleonomic drives to them. They're driven in some way, which to me says you've got a degree of sophistication within our bodies which is far greater than modern synthesis even admits.
Yes. Yes.
So if that's the case, how long did it take to get those systems in place according to a methodologically naturalistic process?
Yeah, they're the people who discuss this. They kind of, if they're either non-Darwinian, or if they are Darwinian, they tend to be very silent about that question. The general view is not that they're silent. What they say is that because these are benefit generating, they are selectable features, right? So you kind of, but that doesn't actually answer the question.
So you avoid it by turning it into the passive, sort of into the passive mode. Yes. It is happening. Okay.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a great paper by Dembski on this actually called "Searching Large Spaces."
Okay.
And what he points out is that the search for a search is actually a harder problem than just a single search.
Okay.
And so if you back it up and you create evolutionary teleonomy, that's not his words, but if you impose my wording on him, if you have evolutionary teleonomy, that's actually a harder problem than just the organism by itself.
Okay.
So it actually would make the time problem harder.
Okay.
Now, this is actually what happens a lot in Evo Devo, is that evolutionary developmental biology and evolution, what they'll do is they'll say, oh, well, evolution is very easy because it's just the reconfiguration of these parts.
Okay.
So it's like, well, where did the parts come from? It's like, oh, well, evolution is just reconfiguration parts, so it's not very hard. And it's not only do you have to have the parts to reconfigure, because they're like, oh, well, your body is set to naturally, all these things happen in concert, because if you change the bone structure, the blood vessels naturally follow. I don't know, I'm not a developmental biologist, but like, for example, the blood vessels follow the skeletal structure or something like that.
Okay.
And so it basically all these things happen automatically, but you have to have the program that allows the blood vessels to follow the bone structure.
Okay.
And so you wind up with you're basically just making a harder problem earlier. You might be able to get an easier problem now, but it's in exchange for a harder problem earlier.
Right.